right in here. So I'm Zach Tavlin from Liberal Arts and BCS. I run the SAIC Humanities Colloquium, of which this is one as event that is sponsored by ATSP, of which I believe, Lou, you are a representative? Yeah. Oh, you are a representative here.
Lots of representatives.
Co-representatives.
There's all kinds of representatives.
So thank you to you all, to you two, and all of you who are here. It's a good turnout for this, I think. So I'm going to introduce Seth, basically, and the book just a little bit, and then turn it over. Then at the end, I'm going to come back up, maybe start the conversation, and then turn things over into Q&A for you all to ask Seth questions, talk to Seth and us about the presentation, the project, whatever. So Seth Kim Cohen, as I assume many in this room already know, is professor of art history, theory, and criticism here at SAIC. Rock and Roll versus Modern Life, 2023 from Bloomsbury, is his fourth book. They're preceded by One Reason to Live, Conversations About Music, that was Errant Bodies, 2006. The Blink of an Ear Toward a Non-Cochlear Sonic Art, Bloomsbury, 2009. And Against Ambience, Bloomsbury, 2013. Which means by the dates alone, the book we're discussing today is Seth's, I think, longest gestating academic print project. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. His work also includes music, performance, audio, video, text, and installation. His bands, Fire Show, Names of Music, and Number One Cup, have released over a dozen albums altogether. And this is what it says on the back cover of this book. They have performed on all but 3 continents. I encourage you to, like I have, to guess which 3 they did not perform on. Seth has also exhibited his work in not-for-profit spaces around the world. His critical work seems to, from an altitudinal standpoint, be of a piece in understanding music and sound art as non-cochlear, and shaped and unshaped according to many of the same cultural, political, and economic pressures felt and metabolized by conceptual art, minimalism, and appropriation aesthetics. Seth is a deconstructionist, I think, admittedly and unabashedly, and Rock and Roll versus Modern Life begins with some parataxis that ends up turning over and collapsing as it goes, and I quote, "I am a camera, you are a camera, all of us cameras." The first thing in this book the camera frame can't quite catch or corral is Iggy Pop descending into the audience at the 1970 Cincinnati Pop Festival. Here, modernity's passion for singularity, for getting an even light on the situation, doesn't hold steady. The critical conversation that ensues thinks through rock as a crucible for the tenuous, perhaps untenable or increasingly untenable belief that, quoting Seth, art can transcend the experiences, the structures, and the values that by the mid-1960s had entrapped the inhabitants of the modern world in a cube of mirrors turned inside out. Can modernity frame out the frame beyond which songs, performances, objectless text events spill? What are the implications if it can't? Today, Seth will discuss with us one particular chapter from the book alongside and in conversation with his practice as a musician. So, Seth.
Thanks so much, Zach. God, it really sucks when you know your talk is going to be worse than the introduction. But it is. So yeah, thank you for coming, all of you. This is a really nice turnout. And I also want to thank the 3 departments that were involved in putting this together, Liberal Arts, ATSP, and Art History. So thanks to all the departments. So as Zach has pointed out, I'm going to kind of talk about my work both in terms of research and scholarship, but also in terms of my creative practice, which has taken a lot of different forms, as Zach mentioned. But specifically, I'm going to talk about music and how some research on my most recent book project fed into some work in the musical realm. So I'm going to kind of walk through a little bit of my history in order to get us to that moment. Hopefully it's not too, what's the right word?
Narcissistic?
Narcissistic, sure. Hopefully it's not. We'll see. You'll be the judge of that. All right, so hello. So a long time ago, early to mid 90s, I played in a rock band called Number One Cup, based here in Chicago. There I am, a long time ago. This was on a tour of England, playing at Royal Holloway College. And so I was playing in this band in the early 90s, but I also was doing some critical writing about music. Over the years, I played in a few different bands from this band, Number One Cup, between 94 and 99. Then 99 to 2002, a band called The Fire Show. And then I took some time off, I got a PhD. I started making some work that found its home more in the art world than in the music world, galleries and museums. Did that for the better part of a decade. And then in 2020, what happened in 2020? Oh yeah, global pandemic. The global pandemic, I found myself kind of like everyone else, stuck at home, and picked up the old musical equipment again, and started making some recordings, and over the course of the pandemic released 8 full-length albums, for lack of anything better to do. I was also baking bread. So during all this time period, as I was making music and then later art, I was also writing about music and art. This started off in the early 90s here in Chicago, putting out a fanzine called Pop Stock, which I produced myself in the after hours of my day job on the copy machine, and would ride around on my bicycle around Chicago, dropping this off at bookstores, record stores, bars, restaurants, cafes, that sort of thing. We did 2 smaller editions that went with a cassette, where we had local bands contribute music to a cassette, and then we inserted the little mini version of the magazine into the cassette. So, little cultural industry stuff there. And then, based on the writing I was doing in Pop Stock, I was contacted by the editors at the Chicago Reader, who asked me to start doing music criticism for the Reader. So I was writing album reviews, live reviews, and also contributing to a new column that they started in '94 called Rock Etc., which was kind of long form essays about music, a little broader, a little less specific to a particular work or performance. So I was doing that, but because I was also a musician at the time, playing in the same scene that I was reporting on, I wanted to create a little distance between my creative practice and my critical practice, and also protect my bandmates. So I wrote under a pseudonym, the pseudonym of Warren Sentence, which has a very long backstory that I'm not going to get into, but it kind of works on its own. So I wrote under the pseudonym of Warren Sentence for the Chicago Reader from 1994 to 2001. Then, as Zach pointed out, after doing my PhD and sort of very slowly working my way into academia, I started publishing books. These are the 4 that I've published thus far. And what I'm going to talk about for the most part today is the most recent one, Rock and Roll versus Modern Life. So I'm going to read a little bit from one chapter of the book. This is chapter 6, which is titled Gnostics of the North, or Music to Recolonize Your Anxious Capitalist Dreams by. So I'm going to read a little bit of that and then continue on with some other things. Starting in the late 1950s, a wave of decolonization swept across Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Asia. Cambodia in 1953, Malaysia and Ghana in 1957, Cameroon, Togo, Mali, Nigeria, Congo, and others in 1960, Kuwait in 1961, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Rwanda, and Uganda in 1962, Singapore in 1963, Barbados in 1966, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain in 1971, and the Bahamas in 1973. Rather than beat a hasty retreat, the former colonial powers reconceived the ex-colonies as emerging markets and as locations of natural resource extraction. Individual territories were no longer the property of one or another imperial nation. Rather, they were sites of contestation, of market competition. Initially, this put the newly independent nations of the global south at a disadvantage. Without robust national economies, durable infrastructures, and stable governments, these countries were at the scant mercy of the industrial economies of the north. Between 1971 and 1973, when US President Richard Nixon finally instituted a floating exchange rate, international exchange rates began to fluctuate wildly. Recently decolonized nations without the tools to hedge against such fluctuations found themselves at a significant new disadvantage. But this emerging economic order was not played out strictly between nation states. Multinational corporations took advantage of these changing dynamics, stepping into the gaps vacated by colonial powers. As Giovanni Arrighi argues, the expansion and consolidation of corporate activities, quote, created an additional powerful vested interest, the interest of the corporations themselves, in preserving maximum present and future flexibility in the use of third world resources for the benefit of first world states, unquote. At the same time as the newly sovereign states began to claim autonomy and agency with regard to their natural resources, the pressure on supplies generated by the expansion of the US regime of accumulation would inevitably implode in the form of excessive competition within and among first world states. In other words, once decolonized states began to control the extraction, output, and prices of their valued resources, the price mechanism of capitalist markets would drive down real returns on capital investment to levels deemed unacceptable by northern corporate interests. Crucially, it is in this context that oil becomes a critical global commodity. As the North and West become increasingly dependent on oil for the manufacture and distribution of goods, oil-producing nations find themselves newly empowered. In 1973, for the first time, OPEC utilizes the tool of embargo, forcing the price of oil to quadruple in a matter of months. As Arrighi points out, quote, the price of crude oil had already begun to rise prior to the shock of 1973. But it was the virtual acknowledgement of defeat by the US government in Vietnam, followed immediately by the shattering of the myth of Israeli invincibility during the Yom Kippur War, that energized OPEC into effectively protecting its members from the depreciation of the dollar and in imposing on the first world a substantial oil rent. According to Quinn Slobodian, quote, the oil shock of 1973-74 placed post-colonial actors at center stage. Robust demands for economic redistribution and stabilization were enshrined in the declaration of a new international economic order, championed by the world's poorer nations and passed by the UN General Assembly in 1974, unquote. Needless to say, the powers of the global north did not lay down and die. Instead, they imagined into being a new model of capitalism based on the rhetoric of anti-totalitarianism and freedom, of individuals and markets, and on the material reality of policies and practices constructed to ensure that markets would be insulated from the untoward influence of the unwanted actors of the newly unshackled global south. Slobodian refers to this effort as the encasement of markets. Rather than freeing markets from all the tethers of regulation, oversight, and state interference, as the story has been told through successive mouthpieces, Slobodian suggests that what neoliberals have actually done is to build a political economy whose primary responsibility is to encase the market in a shell, protecting it from outside influences such as governments, electorates, indeed from the corruptions of democracy. The result is not a market that freely responds to evolving realities of lived experience, but a market that obeys only its own hermetic, self-perpetuating logic, continuing to serve the same actors it has always served. Right, so you might be wondering what the hell this has to do with rock and roll, and I'll try to build that bridge right now. So in my doing the research for this chapter and on these topics, I came across some information and a particular work of art that kind of caught my attention. This all revolves around the figure of Carlos the Jackal, born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, who was a terrorist in the 1970s, committed a number of terrorist acts, is currently in prison in France, serving a life sentence. There was a film made about Carlos the Jackal by the French director Olivier Assayas called Carlos, starring Edgar Ramirez. It's quite a long film, 5.5 hours long. But when I was doing some research into Carlos the Jackal and thinking about this film and watching the film, I came across a pretty interesting quotation from the music critic Greil Marcus. Let me see if I can find that real quick. So Greil Marcus, writing about the way that music is used in the film Carlos, says that the songs used in the film, which are generally post-punk songs, that these songs, quote, raise the question of whether the best and most adventurous music of the late 1970s and early 1980s was itself as animated by international terrorism, by the specter of a world where at times it could seem that only a few armed Gnostics were in control, as by anything else. So I got intrigued by the film, by the figure of Carlos the Jackal, and also by Greil Marcus's claims about the music used in the film, and the idea that the music could have been energized by global terrorism in the 70s and 80s. So out of this, this research and this kind of tangent in the research, I started to follow some other threads. And that led me eventually to thinking about how I might offload some of that material from the book into another project. And that led to this album, which I produced during the pandemic, right at the end of the pandemic, called Elias in the Wake of the Ideal X. And this is going to take a little bit of explanation, but let me start by playing you one track from the album, and then I'll go on to explain it. a little bit of explanation about the album and its genesis. So the first thing I'll explain is this Elias reference in the title. So back when I was in bands, I was in this band called the Fire Show, and in the Fire Show we took pseudonyms, nom de musique as we called them, and my nom de musique was Elias Nil. And the name Elias is taken from a beloved album of my youth, from my teenage years, for those of you who need a bigger picture of it, an album called Elias of Sunhillow by John Anderson, who was the lead singer of the progressive rock band Yes. It's quite an elaborate album that has a whole backstory about this character named Elias, who sails through the cosmos in this ship that you see pictured on the cover called the Morglade Mover, and he's on this kind of new agey journey of discovery to make everything better. You know, it comes with this pretty elaborate gatefold with a booklet stitched into it with a quite lengthy story about the backstory of the album. So when I took the name Elias as my pseudonym for the band, I wanted to take the kind of starry-eyed new agey-ness of the John Anderson reference and twist it a little bit, so appending the last name Nil to Elias, Nil, meaning zero or zilch. So that was the name that I had taken at the time. And when it came time around to make the record, I was kind of reviving the name and using it again. The second part of it, going back to this, the second part of the album title, In the Wake of the Ideal X, I'll come to in just a second, so bear with me. I'm going to read a little bit more from the book, and then I'll get to that part of it. Still building the bridge. So picking up with Carlos the Jackal. In 1975, the Venezuelan terrorist known as Carlos, born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, and 6 accomplices calling themselves the Arm of the Arab Revolution, raided the annual meeting of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in Vienna. Demanding the liberation of Palestine, they took more than 60 hostages, including the oil and energy ministers of most of the OPEC member states. The OPEC kidnapping is the most notorious entry in Carlos's resume of political violence. Olivier Assayas's 2010 film, Carlos, is an epic examination of the events of which Carlos was both a cause and an effect. The film, which was released simultaneously in its 5.5-hour theatrical form and as a 3-part miniseries on French television, traces the woven structures of Carlos's activities and of international affairs, the ebbs and flows of global power distribution. Key scenes in the film are soundtracked by music that had not yet been produced during the times represented in the film. Instead, at significant junctures, SAS uses post-punk music recorded 5 to 15 years after the facts depicted. And then to think about Greil Marcus's quote that I read earlier, the music in Carlos that Greil Marcus characterizes as the best and most adventurous is part of this big amorphous moment of popular music known as post-punk. The soundtrack includes songs by the Feelies, New Order, the Dead Boys, and a number of songs by the band Wire. Of these, the Feelies and Wire probably bear the most immediate similarities to each other: arty, nerdy, fast, and nervous. New Order is less of each of these things, but via their emergence from the ashes of the band Joy Division, who all but invented arty, nerdy, fast, and nervous, they bear genetic similarities to the Feelies and Wire. Cleveland, Ohio's Dead Boys would seem to be the true outlier here. Their contribution, the song Sonic Reducer, predates the other post-punk songs and the designation of the movement itself by a few years. The song was released in 1977, but had been written and performed some years earlier, originally by Rocket from the Tombs, the proto-punk group that spawned not only Dead Boys, but also the Brechtian art punk ensemble Per Ubu. Dead Boys may qualify as fast and nervous, but they rejected arty and nerdy in favor of more classic rock and roll adjectives like loud, young, and snotty, which happens to be the title of their first album. Surely what Greil Marcus has in mind when he claims that, quote, only a few armed Gnostics were in control, is the fast-paced, virile, cinematic vision of sunglassed, berayed militants on tarmacs beside the airliners of jet travel's golden age. Lone wolves and romantic fighter figures piercing the stability of the world order like scimitars through snake-filled baskets. But the facts of the global geopolitics of the 1970s immediately and irredeemably complicate this myth. First, for Marcus, international terrorism and armed Gnostics in control were meant to live on the same side of history's ledger. The Gnostics are the terrorists. But as we've just rehearsed, there is another group of Gnostics with far greater access to the levers of power, knowledge, and value production. Oil ministers, CEOs of petrochemical firms, central bankers, the International Monetary Fund. History's ledger might then put these Gnostics in one column and terrorists in another, debits opposed to credits. Max Weber famously defined the state as that entity which maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. But under neoliberalism, with so many traditional state functions offloaded to the private sector, this monopoly on violence is extended to the boardroom. As Judith Butler notes, quote, "The physical blow cannot be the only model for thinking about what violence is. Anything that jeopardizes the lives of others through explicit policy or through negligence, and that would include all kinds of public policies or state policies, are practices of institutional or systemic violence," unquote. The colonial powers ceded authority to multinational corporations. As a result, violence no longer takes the form of the whip hand, but of economic oppression, restricted access to healthcare and education, and barriers to democratic participation, all implicitly sanctioned by the state in its abdication of the mechanisms of security, provision, and control. Under neoliberalism, the locations of legitimate violence include the boardroom of the multinational corporation, but exclude the jungle encampment, the barrio, or the equally multinational terrorist organizations with their own divisions focused on markets, black and otherwise, in arms, banking, and drugs. Perversely, this untenable distinction is precisely the one that tautologically defines the international terrorists as those without a claim to legitimate violence, thereby designating their actions as terrorism. Gnostics, it seems, are everywhere, bearing different arms, but armed nonetheless. And when we track the details of the OPEC kidnapping, which ended with none of its intended executions, with no political concessions, and with supposedly friendly Arab states denying the arm of the Arab Revolution permission even to land their hijacked DC-10, we start to see that Gnostics in control were not, and had never been, synonymous with the terrorists. So Marcus isn't simply wrong when he says that it seemed that only a few armed Gnostics were in control. He is complicatedly wrong. There is some truth in his assertion, but it is a different truth than the one he has in mind. Via a similarly tautological loop, equating the best and most adventurous music with a glamorous televisual hipster imaginary of the global terrorist, conjures a vision borrowed from the mythology of rock and roll itself, hearkening back to the very image and ethos that punk and then post-punk allegedly disavowed. Carlos is a rock star only in the most banal senses of the term. A more nuanced understanding of the dynamics of the 1970s and the terrorism of that era and post-punk's various splinter groups shifts the meaning of Marcus's claim. But one has to do quite a bit of cultural math in order to work out this formula for the music used in Carlos. If the Feelies in Wire were arty, nerdy, fast, and nervous, Carlos, as depicted in the film, is none of these things. Rather, he is professional, cool, deliberate, while also prone to outbursts of narcissistic rage. If the music is animated by anything germane to the film, it is not Carlos as armed Gnostic, but the anxiety of the age, an anxiety felt most acutely by the Gnostics of the North. This is the anxiety we hear in the skittery, caffeinated rhythms of the Feelies. There is no pretense to virtuosity or godlikeness. Their music suggests mechanicity, but it's faulty, pre-digital, more art than science, a product not of computerized supply lines, but of the suburban garage and all its quotidian insufficiencies. The anxiety that pulses through the Feelies' music reflects not the itchy Marxist trigger finger, so much as the clattering stock ticker and the flailing efforts of economists to diagnose and tame unforeseen beasts such as 70s stagflation, while we wait in line at the gas pumps in the way back of the family station wagon. What animates this music is instability and perturbation. It is not renegade or revolutionary or even so much as directly critical. Rather, it reflects a disturbance that juddered through the commonplaces of 1970s European and North American culture. The recognition of shifting centers of power, a new awareness that comforting Keynesian certainties were unexpectedly tenuous. It echoes Nixon's televised demonstrations of the paranoid desperation for power. In short, this music announces the advent of the precarity endemic to what we now recognize as the era of neoliberalism. Okay, so coming out of that research, as I said, it kind of led me to a few other things, from Carlos and global terrorism to thinking about global economics and global supply chains in the 70s and 80s. And I ended up reading these two books, which I recommend. The first one called The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger by Mark Levinson, is a book about the extremely boring topic of shipping containers, those boxes that sit on the back of ocean-faring vessels and trains moving goods across oceans. And then the second book that I read by Quinn Slobodian, who I've quoted here, but from a different book. In this book called Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy, Slobodian spends a bunch of time focused on the kind of the imaginaries of the kind of techno-billionaires, the Elon Musks and Peter Thiels of the world. And basically he suggests that they take a model for their vision of the future from these free ports that have been developed around the world, where ships can land and unload goods, and those goods are not subject to any national tariffs or taxes or customs fees. And so corporations and individuals can then store their goods tax-free, while, hopefully from their perspective, those goods increase in value. So for the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks of the world, they're imagining a kind of global network of these kind of free ports, where we would all live in these little enclaves that are ruled entirely by markets and not at all by anything like democracy. So that research didn't end up in the book, but it led in this different direction towards the album. And that informs the second part of the title, Elias in the Wake of the Ideal X. The Ideal X is the first ever custom-built container ship, really retrofitted. It was already a ship, but they retrofitted it for containers, for shipping containers. And this was the first boat to ever move shipping containers. It moved them from the port of Baltimore to Houston. And this was the kind of test for whether shipping containers could be successfully moved and kind of standardized in a way that would serve global shipping interests. So that kind of fed into the creation of the album, coming out of the Elias of Sunnylow album and this booklet inside. I decided to make an album about global shipping. And it's kind of the way that it sort of represents the global economy and neoliberalism. And so my record follows the kind of model of the Elias of Sunnylow record. I also have a booklet with a long story inside the gatefold. And the album sort of tells the story of this character, Elias, who's kind of the victim, fighting this battle against this character named the Oracle, who is sort of this Jeff Bezos type character, and then his henchman known as the Customs Captain, who is a kind of infinitely replaceable character. As soon as he's knocked off, you can just usher someone else into that position. And so that's kind of the story behind the record. So I'm going to play you one more track from the record, and then we can talk a little bit. So these are some of the pages from the internal booklet. Okay, so one more song and then we'll have a chat. Thanks. Please let me get to the stage.
So I think maybe I'll start by maybe posing one question and trying to stuff as much into this question as I can, and then opening it up and seeing what you all think. What ask Seth, whatever you want. I'm not gonna. Well, okay, whatever you want. So this is just my experience reading this first to kind of give a little bit of an overview. So that, like, when I looked at this title, I wasn't prepared for how interested you are. This is sort of directly connected to the subject matter of the chapter you're talking about here. How much your attention is clustered around 8 years or so, with examples drawn, a little bit earlier and a bit later. But in that pocket of late 60s through the mid 70s, with some examples, post-punk and stuff coming a little bit later. And so you're talking a little bit about how the archive you're interested in, like Velvet Underground, James Brown, Patti Smith, 75 Horses, the Iggy Pop performance, 1970. How much that's informed by not looking at rock music, sort of the rise of rock music, but the rise of neoliberalism, which is hard to date, but I mean, 1971 is a very useful date people have used, as you mentioned, Bretton Woods, the floating exchange rate, that kind of thing. I think that's where Jameson dates it. So, like, looking at the title, I'm thinking, okay, rock and roll, this is a very antiquated thing. In fact, it's sort of like the art form that's kind of the antiquity of neoliberalism in some ways. Like the novel would be the antiquity of capitalism more broadly. And so I'm wondering, like, as just a critical project, your key, and you mentioned Graham Marcus in your talk, he also is in conversation with a lot of rock critics, Lester Bangs, Dan Graham, And you say at one point, one of the things that like Lester Bangs in particular is interested in is kind of getting inside the muck of rock, being in the club, being in the studio. And you have this, your interest in Slobodian and these sort of larger economic processes. You seem to be coming at it sort of in this later game way of looking back at something that's already passed. So just with your critical project and thinking about rock music as, I don't know if it's a symptom or it's a contradiction. Like, is that what rock is here? Is it a contradiction in the slow decline of empire and the rise of neoliberalism? Like, how do you define that object, that critical object?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question that really gets at a lot of the things that I think are important in the project. So what I was trying to do was to think about how this time period, mid-60s to mid-80s, there's this kind of cultural friction at the time between the way that political economy is moving and the way certain aspects of intellectual life or cultural life are moving. They're kind of either, you can think of it as either they're in some sort of fight with each other or they're moving in different directions from each other. And so I was thinking about things like the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, feminism, but also things like conceptual art, where the definitions of the thing that we're supposed to be concerned with are shifting sort of below our feet. And I think a lot of those other things that I've just named get some credit in that time period for pushing back against the kind of commodification of the world, the standardization of kind of modes of living, and just that general sort of movement from capitalism, late capitalism, neoliberalism. So there's I think there is some acknowledged friction between feminism, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, maybe conceptual art, and modern life, as I'm calling it. But I don't feel like rock and roll has often been included in that conversation in the same way. It's not taken as seriously, for one thing, but it's also not seen as being a kind of cohesive project. And my experience, this isn't like, I don't feel like I'm imposing this onto the subject or the time period. My experience has always been that rock and roll was the thing that taught me how to think differently about the world than Ronald Reagan, who was president when I was in high school, was telling me to think about the world. And so I wanted to kind of pull all that stuff together and say that, Iggy Pop, Dan Graham, Patti Smith, Carolee Schneemann, that they're all kind of involved in the same very, large project, even if their methodologies differ. I don't know if that gets at what you were trying to ask.
Yeah, rock is a name for a big thing in your book.
Sure.
And I think that's interesting. So that I would love to invite anyone, and maybe I'll stand up so I can see in the back, anyone who wants to jump in, have a question about anything presented, about the book, whether you read it or not. Yeah.
Just about the last album you've been talking about. What was your earlier music work also informed by just the whole idea of like a very elaborate concept album? Was this the first time you kind of explored that? I know you mentioned it was inspired by something like from your childhood.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
This beauty.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm curious if you had worked on things like that before.
Definitely nothing as elaborately conceptual as this, but conceptual in the kind of rock and roll sense of conceptual. The concept album of progressive rock bands of the '70s. I mean, I was trying to kind of use this as a kind of template for what I was doing. So I wanted it to have this, kind of preposterous story, And I wanted it to have, you know, the text that goes inside that kind of contributes to your understanding of the music and the illustrations. But I also wanted to do it in a much more fanzine kind of way. So my booklet is, there's just a string here and it's just kind of strung into the middle. It's not properly bound. And all, you know, the illustrations are all done on a copy machine, the way I used to do my fanzine. So, you know, I'm trying to do the kind of the non-vainglorious version of a prog rock concept album, you know. And in that sense, maybe it becomes a little more conceptual, as in conceptual art, because I'm playing off other reference points. And I think in order to make sense of this album, it helps at least to kind of understand how all those threads are being pulled together. So, meaning basically that there are very few people who are going to bother to listen to this. Fair enough.
No, it's more of a general question to say about, in general, also being in a band and thinking in relation to history and political dynamics. I think every person who's been in a band knows the feeling of being in a rehearsal room that really feels like a micro world that is almost kind of separated also from external reality. And also, so in some way, I was wondering if, how do you, in your book, if you address this element of autonomy, so to say, that even rock and roll itself can have. I mean, there's a lot of rock and roll and post-punk music that is deliberately political, and it speaks about politics. But real life experience of people being in a band, it allows you also to say, I don't want to think about Ronald Reagan, and I don't want to think about the oil crisis. And this might appear as a limit, but actually for a lot of people with the music is an advantage. It says, I own, so to say, this space, being the rehearsal room. And that's incredible about rock, and I think it's the reason why so many people play metal or any kind of music so I was wondering, because that's what we are taught in art, in PhD programs, that everything is political, society determines everything, but what about this autonomous dimension of music itself, its own self-playful necessity? How do you address that, and in general also in your work, how do you think about this dimension?
Yeah, I kind of reject that autonomy, as you're calling it, or that kind of insulation, because that's never been the way I've experienced music. It's always opened windows from the rehearsal space or the bedroom onto the world. So when I've listened to music of any kind, really, I'm always thinking, in a sense, through the music to who made this, why did they make it, who paid for it, who did they imagine their audience was, what is the message, whether that's an explicit lyrical message or a musical message of some kind. That's how I've always experienced music from my very earliest listening experiences. So I never felt that music did that. It never insulated me from the world. It always introduced me to the world, but also created detours from the dominant narrative of the world. Because I was in high school during Reagan's presidency. In fact, a funny story, my high school had an FM radio station, an actual FM broadcast radio station in my high school. And I was on the air doing my radio program. And we used to have the AP wire, which was this little machine that would send in the news on the hourly basis so that our high school students could read the news. But there was a little bell code for how serious the news coming across the wire was. One bell was just the hourly update, 3 bells was something important, and 5 bells was the maximum. It was like national emergency. And I'm sitting there on the, in the radio booth playing some song, and the bell starts going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm like, fuck. Because I thought the missiles were coming. What else would you think in the 80s? The missiles are coming, right? So I turn around, I rip off the little sheet of paper, and Reagan had been shot. and I was 15 or something, I had to get on the radio and say, ladies and gentlemen, we have a breaking news story. President Ronald Reagan has been shot outside a hotel in Washington, D.C. So, you know, music and those kinds of events have always been in some kind of dialogue with each other for me. And so all my scholarly work has been explicitly about this, about the fact that music and any kind of work with sound is always engaged with a whole set of issues outside of the music itself. Economic issues, issues of identity, issues of politics, issues of history, philosophy, the other arts, all of that is happening in and around music all the time. So I've just never had that experience that you're describing, although I know it's real. I know people do have that experience.
Kind of building off of that, I'm curious a little bit about the timeline of producing the album in the pandemic, and maybe particularly like given this research and depending on what phase of the pandemic you were working in, what was happening with like ports being closed or like the unknowns of how the economic impacts of things were going to happen, and then now to be outside of that unknown territory, like how that has shaped your relationship to the music. Or
Yeah, I don't know, I haven't really thought about that, but I would guess, looking back, that we all, like the phrase supply line or supply chain suddenly became part of all of our, our lexicon. So I would guess to some degree that was kind of unconsciously making me think about like the Ideal X, the ship, and shipping containers and things like that. Like, why did I pick up this book to begin with during the pandemic? It probably had something to do with that, although I don't think I was aware of it at the time. And then learning about this, that there was, there was literally a moment of genesis of this system. Like, this one businessman thought, oh, I'm going to make these boxes and I'm going to put them on ships and trains, and he was right. It's become dominant. So yes, but I haven't thought much about the second part of your question about whether kind of getting back to quote unquote normal has changed the way I think about the project or the music. Or, I don't know, I haven't really forced myself to confront that. Maybe I should, I don't know. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Well, this is going to be one of my like overgeneralized reductivist questions, but do you think rock and roll can ever escape its nostalgia, and do you think it actually does anything relative to these political questions that you're talking about?
Can I answer by reading a little bit?
Sure.
So I confront this in the final chapter. I realize that there is a sense of nostalgia and of kind of overly optimistic interpretation of rock and roll's powers.
No, I'm not talking about interpretation. I'm talking about rock and roll itself.
Yeah. My interpretation of rock and roll's power to actually affect anything in the world.
Yeah.
So I try to, in the last chapter, I try to say, look, I know this in some way is a failed project, and I tried to point out moments where it might not have been a failed project, but in the end it probably is a failed project. So in the end I try to deal with that. So I'm just going to read the last page and a half. It's inevitable. This account threatens to slip into romanticism. It practically must. In the end, this argument on behalf of rock and roll's place in post-war culture, positioning it as the site or device of the neutral, using a term from Roland Barthes, a refuser of the frame and its insistence on the thingness of both matter and ideas, is bound to slide back into the swamp of raucous self-assurance, a mysticism born of arrogance. I realize and am resigned, but if in glimpses and pilfered impressions, tiny incessant scratchings against the doors we've been taught to keep shut, a familiar sensation rises along the ridges of your knuckles in the crackly echo of a dusted-off memory, in the pang of a yearning that has yet to arrive. If you recognize the effects described herein, if you felt them brush your cheek just before melting, then I've paid my debt to rock and roll. There's little I can offer by way of conclusion. The refusal of the frame is equally the refusal of conclusion. Bart saw this too. He knows he cannot capture the neutral stuff and mount it. No skin, not a frame, but a skeleton around and within which, over and under and through, the organs, the nerves, the viscera are woven impermanently, fragilely. Escape and capture play to a draw. We build the skeleton from terms in which the neutral tinkles. So too here, constructed with a selection of Bart's terms, rock and roll as I have experienced it, as I understand it. Benevolence, weariness, silence, tact, sleep, affirmation, anger, consciousness, rights, R-I-T-E-S, conflict, oscillation, retreat, intensities, and lastly, one of my own, not death, for now. I'll leave it there.
That was actually my question. I actually wanted to know what rock and roll does to, like, within, to, and against neoliberalism within a particular time period. It sounds like, based on that, including that passage, that focused a lot on affect.
On affect?
Affect, yeah, the affective intensities of rock and roll, right? Like what it does to our sensations, our bodies, the force of rock and roll, and all the words that, as well as epistemology and consciousness. So I was wondering, that's really great theoretical work. I was wondering if you could maybe expand more on some of the case studies of Iggy Pop and James Brown and the others that you mentioned, and how they demonstrate this kind of affective force or affective intensity, or the way that you've described it with art, and what rock and roll does to, within, against,
For me, it's not affect. I'm not sort of on that train, the affect train. But you mentioned epistemological, what was your phrase? Epistemological something? I'm much more interested in like epistemological frames than affective frames, if affective frames are even frames. But that's a significant device in the book, is the idea of the frame. That so much of capitalism, late capitalism, neoliberalism, wherever those divisions fall, is about framing. It's about finding the thing itself and identifying it so we can name it, categorize it, commodify it, sell it, collect it, own it, tax it, whatever. And what the argument that I make through some of those figures like James Brown, Iggy Pop, is that there are moments in, and the book primarily focuses on televised or filmed performances rather than audio recordings. And so what rock and roll does in those performances, in the way that I read them, is to test or puncture or escape that frame in some way, to show us that the frame is not inviolate, the frame is not permanent and irrevocable, that it can be questioned, subverted, and again, I admit at the end of the book that perhaps this is a failed project in the long run, but in these moments there might have been little flashes of recognition that the frame doesn't necessarily have to be there, So for example, I think it's easier to give you a concrete example. In the Iggy Pop performance that Zach mentioned in his introduction, this is a performance from the 1970 Cincinnati Pop Festival. And this is maybe the first pop or rock festival that was filmed for television. And the way they did it was they filmed the entire 12-hour ordeal. And they edited it down to 90 minutes for TV broadcast. And it was covered by the local Cincinnati television news crew. So it's this guy named Jack Lasculi in a suit and tie who just is the picture of 1970 squareness. And he's trying to kind of explain to a TV audience that they assume is going to be sort of equally square, what's going on, what this whole thing is about, what are these kids doing? Is it something we should worry about? You know, that's kind of the implicit tone of the broadcast. And there's a moment kind of early on in Iggy's performance when he goes into the crowd, as he was wont to do. So he jumps into the crowd, he disappears, and Jack Lasculi announces to the TV audience, Iggy's gone into the crowd, this would be a good time to break away for a message. And they go to a commercial. Because, you know, think about it, if you're there, and especially if you're right there, that moment that's the moment. But if you're watching on TV, suddenly everything goes away, there's nothing to look at anymore. The star, the focal point, is gone and the frame no longer makes any sense. So I talk about that as a moment when like Iggy reveals the constructedness of the frame and how the televisual medium and the broadcast is struggling to retain the frame and Iggy's ignoring it, you know. Not knowingly, but you know, in some way knowingly. And there's just a moment just a little bit later when he goes into the crowd again and Jack Lasculi says, Iggy's got back into the crowd, we're trying to get a light on him now. Which could be the like slogan, the advertising slogan for the Enlightenment. We're trying to get a light on him now. And then the really interesting moment is, he says, we're trying to get a light on him, singular, now. And then they organize some lights and they get it on the spot in the crowd where he's disappeared. And then Jack Lasculi says, there they are, and it goes to plural, from singular to plural. And suddenly this moment is not about Iggy anymore. Inadvertently, according to Lasculi, it's now about them or us. So those kinds of moments are where I'm trying to like dig out an example of where the frame breaks down or is subverted in some way. Granted, it's not, you know, it's not a major disruption to neoliberalism, but I think it's in those little moments, and this is, you know, when we talk about art's capability to be political, to affect political change, sometimes it's in those moments of just a change of perspective for an audience member or a handful of audience members to see things a little differently, and from there, you know, move forward. Maybe.
Can I respond, maybe connect this a little bit to Donato, your question from earlier. So I greatly enjoy this book, and then there's a part of me also that wrestles with a little bit of the anti-formalism in your work. And so, like, imagine, I am asking this question, but imagine, you know, a cranky formalist is asking this question. Is it possible? Is it perhaps true that, I wonder, is the frame, the television frame or the televised frame, is that the only metaphor we can have for form? And in that I mean form of a rock song, something we would call the object, an album, a track, a song, etc. So, like, what if the frame is something more like the process by which something is made? And by that, I mean, how do we identify that this is rock music? Which would mean identifying something like these particular forms, these particular styles, right? It's not a sort of static frame, but it is a sort of more flexible way of thinking about form that would accept everything you're saying about the sort of form-busting, televisual conflict with rock performance, without totally giving up on the idea that there's an object there. That would be a sort of like how do you deal with that question? Because that actually is my question.
So you are the cranky formalist?
Yeah, I'm playing that role.
So you said in your introduction that I'm a deconstructionist, and so the Derridian kind of answer to this is, you know, it falls along that divide between the ergon and the parerga in you know, Kant and then Derrida. And so the idea is that the thing itself, whatever you want to call the thing itself, the song, the commodity object, the performance, whatever you want to call the object, is constructed by all the things it is not, by all the things on its periphery, all the supplements that that would be normally thought of as exterior to the thing. But according to Derrida, when you get down to it, are actually instrumental in sort of constituting the thing. So if you follow that line of thought, if you do, then there is no thing. There's only this kind of dispersed constellation of stuff. And as it sort of coalesces, there's a kind of empty center, and we kind of point at that empty center and say that thing. But, you know, to paraphrase Gertrude Stein, there's no there there. There is instead, there is, if you're really like a hardcore Derridian, you can make the argument that there's no ergon. There's no thing itself. There's only the parerga that construct what we call the thing, but the thing itself doesn't really exist. Because wherever you want to identify its border, where it ends and other stuff begins, it's impossible to find that border, according to Derrida. So that's how I would deal with it. No, I wish I could think of the exact phrase, but there's a Rosalind Krauss thing that I've used in a few things I've written, where she's talking about postmodern practices, and she says it's no longer about material or the perception of material, it's now about a constellation of terms in conflict in a cultural context, or something like that. That's pretty close, but it might not be exactly right. And I think that's what she's describing also, because this was also in her kind of Derridian moment. She's talking about how it's the and in one of the things I've written, I try to dissect the terms in her quote. What does she mean when she says terms? Does she mean just language, just words, descriptors? Or does she mean something closer to what you were describing, a set of practices, a set of traditions, a set of methodologies that we can think of as terms that form the thing we then want to call the object or the work?
Yeah, so I guess here's a Derridian response to the Derridian response is that Derrida also says there's no outside text. And one way of reading that is the same thing you're talking about is actually true of everything in the world. And therefore we can't distinguish the sort of art object as more, as less centered or less present than anything. In which case we still have ordinary practices by which we want to call things things. And that's all we're doing when we're doing that.
Yeah, it's not like Derrida himself or any Derridian abandons the word thing. We just, you know, we have air quotes going inside our brains as we use the word thing or hear the word thing. Yeah.
When thinking about that, like the thing itself defined solely by the outside, and its relationship to rock and roll as a growing medium, I feel like wouldn't that lead to a little bit of obscurity, especially when you're considering like nostalgia with rock and roll, and then the preconceived like energy of that, and then the ever-growingness of things solely being defined by everything surrounding it and not just the object itself. How do you pursue conceptualism and conceptual art with this growing nature of obscurity if you are to define things by like just the outside?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know what you mean by obscurity, though. Can you clarify that?
It's more just like, you know, when you like go and see something that is backed by a ton of like research, but you don't really see it up front.
Yeah.
I feel like when you're listening to music, especially new music that's like electronically made with new electronic instruments, it might be hard for like just people in general to understand where these things are coming from and stuff like that.
Yeah. I don't think people in general exist. You know, like I think everything that's ever been produced has been produced for a particular audience, a particular segment of people in general, and so you can't assume that like, you know, anybody is going to take an interest in this, pay any attention to it, or give it any time. It's, you know, I acknowledge it's for a pretty small, select audience, self-selecting audience. So I don't really worry about that. I mean, I always feel like every practice has its kind of discrete audience for whom it's really intended. Other people might have casual encounters with it. This goes for everything from, you know, this to baseball. You know, where if you go to a baseball game with, you know, 3 people, one of them doesn't know anything about baseball, doesn't know the rules, has never seen a baseball game, one of them generally knows the rules but doesn't really follow, and the other one's a dyed-in-the-wool fan who knows every player's statistics. They're all going to have very different experiences of the baseball game, all of them valid on some level in some way, but the one who knows the most is probably going to get the most out of it, right? Like, they're dedicated to it, so they have a relationship with that practice, and I'm fine with that. Like, I just think it's inevitable for one thing, but I also kind of like that, you know, we will find ourselves, the people who are interested in this stuff. Yeah.
Like, in your business, do you resonate with, like, do you resonate more with the idea of rock and roll, like in your music, rather than like the accuracy of the sound? Like do you resonate more with like 60s and 70s rock, like organization of the sound, or their use of like how they organize messages and such? I don't know. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure, could you rephrase it?
I guess just like, do you prioritize the idea?
Is it like, I mean, one version of that's like, where's rock in your music? Is that, I mean, that's sort of, I don't think that gets at what you're saying, but that's a version of it.
I guess like, where does your art like fit into your research and like with like the idea of like rock and roll and like with the accuracy of the sound, like where does that fit compared to it? Not that it needs to, but like what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think of this as rock and roll. Yeah, I think like Zach, you have a narrower definition of the term rock and roll than I do. You know, for me, it's anything that sort of comes from the very broad family tree of the stuff that came out of Chess Records here in Chicago. Basically, that's my definition. And this comes out of it. So does hip hop. So does so much stuff. So in terms of making the music, in terms of the research feeding into the record, that's one way that it happens. The other way is that, stylistically, I'm basically trying to do a kind of stylistic mashup between the progressive rock that I loved as a teenager and the post-punk that I've listened to ever since college, and those things both come up in the book as well. So I'm trying to like find ways to pull together different moments of my interests and tastes and construct a kind of new thing that doesn't quite yet exist. Granted, it's a very small niche that it's fitting itself into, but that, I'm thinking about that too when I'm making the musical part of it, not just the kind of backstory part of it.
As for like, your definition, you said your definition is very wide when it comes to the definition of rock and roll and what that means to you. I also have a pretty broad definition in my mind of what that means, and I think I wanted to ask, do you mean that like for you rock and roll, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is more of like a set of values and like where something comes from? It's like a root. It's like a train of thought. It's not. It's a way of thinking, and it's less of a specific sound. Or like, is it like it's more like a movement than and like a group of people rather than just like one specific sound?
I think this is where the history part of my landing in the art history department comes in. It's really a matter of a certain trajectory of practices, one which couldn't have happened without the preceding one. And if you follow that trail, you end up, it does bifurcate and trifurcate and quadrifurcate. you know, so it ends up in a lot of different places, but if you follow all those trails back, you know, small ensemble music using a certain fairly limited set of instruments, with certain musical forms in terms of duration, in terms of rhythms, in terms of harmonic content. I think
So you admit it. You admit it. Those are the forms right there.
They exist, but they are not the form. You want to fight?
That would be rock and roll.
I have a little follow-up.
Yeah, please.
Are you, oh wait, shoot, it just left my mind. Same thing. Yeah.
I have to say, as an audience, you guys don't really understand how this is supposed to work. At an academic talk, ask one or two perfunctory questions and everybody leaves. You're asking so many questions. No, it's great. I appreciate it.
So part of me thinks maybe like rock and roll for Seth seems to be sort of also like it's like some kernel of something that breaks stuff apart, right? Is that fair? Or it gets into like it's I don't want to say it's a force because that's not right, but there's something it's difference. It's a name for difference. It's
But everything is, as you said.
Yeah, no, but this is one of the new labels for it. Like it's a kind of it's a thing that reveals. Tell me if you think this is fair. It's a thing that reveals that modern hygiene doesn't get all the dirt. Right? It's sort of like it bears the contradiction. It shows a contradiction. It doesn't necessarily solve that contradiction. But it opens it up.
It's funny, I have a song out on this record called Our Modern Sanitary Sensibility. Gonna go straight to that metaphor.
Yeah, you want to follow? Yeah.
I just remembered my question. I apologize for the neurons were firing and then they didn't happen and now they're happening. But I was thinking, as you were answering my previous question, how do you think like it's like it comes in phases, not necessarily phases, but it comes in steps. I should say. Do you think necessarily there are specific stages that are more true to rock and roll than others, or are they all equally as valid to be considered rock and roll?
That's an interesting question. I don't want to say that I think any are truer than others. I mean, there's good rock and roll, there's bad rock and roll, there's, yeah, you know, but so I'm thinking more as a, you know, as a set of traditions that that spawn new traditions or new practices, new methods, and whether any of them are better, worse, truer, less true. I'm sure that is the case, right? But I, you know, I wouldn't want to point fingers. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think rock and roll is all about pointing fingers and making those kinds of highly arguable distinctions, right? But I guess I wanted to ask if there's this other thing that I think about in rock and roll, which has to do with amplification, ecstasy, and fantasy. And I think those three things all go together in rock and roll. And do those have a place in what you're writing about? And if so, like how those interact with the economic, political kind of dimensions?
Yeah, that's great. They could, but they don't really enter into this book because this book was really working with that idea of the TV or the film frame, the camera frame, as the structure that needed to be evaded or broken or subverted. So it's not so much about the things you need, but that easily could be a, you know, a parallel book, you know, that could make similar arguments, but along different lines. And if you, going way back, this is really maybe the genesis of the book, when you invited me to come before I worked here to give a talk at a conference that you organized across the street.
Yeah.
I gave what I think is the very first attempt for me at doing this, and trying to think about rock and roll.
Right.
And the thing I was fixated on at that moment was the word intensity,
Yeah.
which I think is closer to maybe what you're describing. And I was trying to do it through a kind of Deleuzian thing, which is really not where I should be, because I'm not a Deleuzian, and I have trouble thinking like Deleuze. I think everybody does. Deleuze has trouble thinking like Deleuze. But that was the first attempt, and I think I was more trying to go at it more from that angle at that time, which was what, 15 years ago, something like that? So I think I tried that, and it wasn't the right way for me to do it. But I could imagine someone doing it that way.
Because I think of like when you're talking about rock and roll and television and televising, I think of what televising is kind of flattening. It's like, oh, I can turn the volume down, which is like the exact opposite of the experience of rock and roll, which is that I can't escape the volume, right? And so that seems to be like the thing that unrock and rolls the rock and roll, you know, like fundamentally.
Yeah, it's that friction that for a broadcast performance, you have to unrock and roll it, but the performance itself is trying to maintain its, what were the words you used? Intensity, energy,
ecstasy.
Ecstasy. Yeah, it's trying to maintain that, even though we're trying to cram it into this screen and also into the volumes that are suitable for broadcast, and that someone can turn it down. So there's a friction there.
It also seems to me like maybe you're interested in two different kinds of ecstasy. Like one is presentness, which you associate with like modernism, right? So like Jonathan Edwards comes up, right? Dan Graham's Rock My Religion is about Puritanism and rock as the weird America in one long history. And then there's the ecstasy that breaks the frame, and then there's the ecstasy of I'm present with the art object, or the transcendence that you are resisting. You're resisting that rock, you know, is a new dimension of that. And so maybe that's a tension that's sort of I don't know being worked through.
This is a great conversation. I wanted to ask a question on production, right? So neoliberalism is characterized by hyper-production of commodities that circulate across the globe and exploit bodies and laborers. And you've also talked about kind of the production of the media frame and how Iggy Pop, in your example, kind of violated the kind of normative neoliberal kind of capitalist production of the frame. And that got me thinking about how the ways in which now media production expands the frame. So if the rock musician goes into the crowd, they actually hone in on that as part of the rock spectrum. So all of this is to say, and then you've also talked about shipping containers and the production of commodities. So I'm curious, are you also situating the work within the kind of hyper-capitalist production of rock and roll music and the ways in which the media frames and the violations of it work against or reproduce?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, in the book, I don't do much of that. I think there are little acknowledgments of it throughout, but it's not a major theme. When some of my students are here, when I teach this stuff in class, we talk about this stuff a bit more. And also the book covers the time periods 1965 to 1985, so it cuts off at a certain moment of kind of hyper-commodification of music, basically the moment of MTV. The Buggles are the last chapter. So it stops there for a reason, because I think something does change at that moment, both in terms of music but also in terms of politics. That's smack dab in the middle of Reagan's reign. You know, so it starts with like Nixon's ascendance and ends with, you know, right in the middle of Reagan, and you know there are reasons for that. I think it's politically, economically, and musically, culturally, there are reasons for that. So if I were to write like volume 2 of this, I would certainly have to you know, deal with that, and the kind of hyper-commodification of music. You know, we're seeing in 65 to 85, we're seeing sort of the nascent commodification. I mean, not exactly nascent, but maybe the teenage years of the commodification of music. Yeah, there's that book by Michael Denning about the early days of phonograph recordings and their effects. It's not so much about the commodification, but that period would be the kind of the true nascency of the commodification of musical objects, I guess.
I wonder too if like if you were to keep going with this history, if like how commodification goes, it's also a frame breaking thing. I mean, digital music is all about breaking frames, right? The playlist structure. I mean, I just wonder like there's a lot of interest in exploding what was once a sort of restrictive frame to music, and that would be sort of a like what that kind of switcheroo is being pulled in terms of music instrument.
Well, let's meet back here in 10 years, and we'll deal with that.
Any last questions? I think we're probably, I haven't been keeping time, but I think we've hit the limit.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, and thank you all for being here. Really, really great. Thank you.